them in an impossible situation. So we're trying to say, all of us really, let's wake up and let's take this opportunity of this incredible turmoil in the world to bring some change, to really look at our societies and find a form of change. You've named the changes that need to be done. In Africa, there's still chronic underfunding in public health. There's the research is not good enough. There's mismanagement of public funds, as we know that. We looking at growth based on GDP rather than on well-being. There's a lot of things that we need to do in order to have to stop being dependent on the rest of the world, and we need to take care of ourselves.
Just a quick question on Europe, because it seems in some quarters that the French protests here in Paris and the protests in Britain were a shock to some people, and people were saying, well, why is it like that in the US? Trying to draw a difference between the US and Europe. And what I've seen from a lot of the protesters and heard from a lot of the protesters in Britain and France is it's very, very similar. In fact, there was a piece in the Guardian this week by a Ghanaian lawyer who pointed out that the percentage of black people incarcerated, young men, in fact, incarcerated in penal institutions in Britain as a percentage of the total black population in the country was actually higher than in the United States. Veronique, do you sense that there's more complacency in Europe about this issue?
Look, it's always difficult and a bit tricky to compare, because you can't compare the United States with the UK or France. That's for sure. Like, for example, in the UK, the police officers are usually unarmed, which I think is not the case in the States. But what I think is true is that the population, the people in the UK and in France are in denial. A lot of people are in denial because we're talking about institutionalized racism. And unless you can experience that sort of racism in the police, you think that this is okay. France is okay. We're not racist. But that is not the experience that black people in general and people of North African descent feel. They feel really that when the police goes down on in the neighborhoods, they're really going for them. For example, facial recognition is something that is very big in France, is that just by looking at you, just by looking at your skin color, your face, whether you're big and like you look like a heavy African man, you can be done for that. Just you look threatening. And this is a big problem, and I think that too many people are in denial. The progressive people, they don't realize what is happening because they don't have the experience of what is happening on the ground.
I just wanted to interject, Patrick, and just mention, you're of course aware a few weeks ago when Camelia Jordana, the French-Algerian actress, mentioned about the racism and how Black people in France are just in fear of the police. And what has been consistent about complaints against police violence all over the world by Black people is how institutional racism is very dismissed, and the pain of Black people is always othered. Oh, maybe you are overreacting. Maybe it's not racism. As if we wouldn't know what racism is, since we've been living in our Black skins all our lives. And the other thing that perhaps also, with this whole Britain and France, the other thing that came up during the course of this discussion, because now everybody is coming up and highlighting the racism in the different places was also with the German police. You know, there is a guy who died while being deported because they had him tied his legs and his hands and he couldn't breathe, and he actually died before he got home. And you know, the compensation that his family got was like 2,000 euros or something crazy like that. But it's just this constant, this stuff that isn't talked about because, oh no, you know, America has Trump. America is much worse. And while in our own homes, these things actually exist.
Well, with that, I wanted to talk to Nanama Danquah, who's on the line in Los Angeles, which is in many ways the belly of the beast. Before we started this podcast, we were chatting about the history of the Los Angeles Police Department, which is one of the most militarized police departments in the United States, and has a pretty appalling record on human rights and abuse of citizens. Maybe we could start off with a question about the response in Los Angeles to the George Floyd killing, because we've seen big protests right across America, and they've been pretty strong in Los Angeles.
I actually wanted to start off with a quote by Toni Morrison, and then I'll talk about Los Angeles. The quote by Toni Morrison is, "People kept saying, oh, the riots. What struck me most about those who rioted was how long they waited. The restraint, not the spontaneity, the restraint. They waited for justice for almost a year, and it didn't come. No one talks about that." And that quote, I keep coming back to it because it is so true. And with Los Angeles in particular, for me to talk about these riots, I'd have to go back to 1992 and talk about the Los Angeles riots that happened on the heels of Rodney King, who was beaten senselessly by officers. And it was probably the first time that something like that had been caught on video. And so everybody was shocked to see it, and the officers were tried and they were found not guilty. And it was one of those things where we were all, you know, just stunned because we all knew what we had seen on the video. And yet somehow these four people were told that it was okay. They could just walk free. And the city erupted in riots that lasted for several days. And the president enacted an old law, an insurrection law. So the National Guard came in. And that was right about when Los Angeles became militarized. Its police became militarized. And I don't know whether the corruption was prior to that or it happened after that, but Los Angeles has the reputation of having one of the most corrupt and brutal police forces in the nation, if not the world. What I was telling you before we came on air was about the Rampart division, which was, they had an anti-crime unit, anti-drugs, anti-crime unit inside the Rampart division. And what was discovered was that they were basically running their own little mafia, robbing banks, stealing narcotics and selling narcotics, shooting people, essentially putting hits out on people. I mean, this is the police. So, you know, if this is the police, who do you call when the police are the ones after you? And that's the question that I think a lot of Black people are asking all the time in the United States. Who do you call when the police are the ones who are after you and treating you badly?
So there's zilch accountability. In fact, there's sort of contra accountability in a way.
Exactly.
have heard some people point out that one of the reasons for the brutality of the cops in the US, apart from the history and the culture and tradition and so on, it's just the physical equipment. That a lot of the military interventions by the US in the Middle East and in Africa, the equipment from those expeditions has come back to the US and has, instead of being retired in sort of military garages or whatever, it's actually been repurposed and given out to police units across the country. Mm-hmm. So the police are actually geared up in the United States as a kind of intervention force in their own society. And that's why we see these armored police vehicles on the streets in the United States. They're very reminiscent of what the apartheid regime would use in South Africa.
Well, the police are definitely very militarized. They're very geared up. But I don't think that's the excuse. I think it's something else. Just because you have something doesn't mean you have to use it. I think also one of the things that I have to say is, because whenever anyone has been speaking of these events, and in fact, when people speak of the rioting and the police brutality, it's generally limited to Black men, and that is not the case. This year, Breonna Taylor was murdered in her bed, in her own bed. Several police officers came into her home, plain clothes, which means that they were not uniformed. They did not identify themselves as police. They entered her home with a no-knock warrant, which is an illegal warrant. It means they could just walk in. So they did that, and her male companion took a gun and, attempted to do what anybody would do if, a bunch of men just walk into your home, which is to protect him and his partner. And so the police fired over 20 rounds, 8 of which hit this woman in her bed, in her home. This woman, who has not committed a crime, was not suspected of committing a crime. They had two people in custody, and they believed that one of them had an involvement with her, and they believed that he may have run or left drugs in her house, and they found nothing. So this woman died needlessly and senselessly.
Zukisa, I wondered to what extent you think the protests against these sort of killings that Nana Amra has just described, and against the murder of George Floyd, have been exacerbated, it's sort of built up by the global situation, the fact that we've got this pandemic around the world, that many countries have been locked down, and in the course of that, exposed these searing inequities in societies in terms of distribution of resources, how people are enduring this pandemic, and indeed the death toll as well, which is inordinately much higher against minority populations and the working classes around the world. To what extent do you think the pandemic has made this global protest movement possible this time?
I think certainly because a lot of us have been at home, and we have then become, those of us who are able to then get online and probably a bit more privileged than everybody else, have been able to now observe what it is that's happening to everybody else in the world. And we're able to share this news because we're not busy in traffic. We're not running around trying to get this and that. Indeed, it was during this protest, as mentioned, on Sunday, there's a big protest in Brazil over the death of 14-year-old João Pedro, who got killed by the police. and he got killed by the police while he was in his aunt's house.